Welcome to Outrage Overload, a science podcast about outrage and lowering the temperature. This is a recap and behind-the-scenes bonus episode. Well, we've been doing this podcast for over 6 months and actually started the research for it. It's been about a year since I started the research, maybe even a little longer. And we've got, 20-something episodes out now. And we thought it was a good time to do a recap. So I'm here with Austin Chen, my co-director and co-editor.
Yeah, thank you. It's nice to be on the show. And I think, this is, such a great opportunity for us to look back at all of these experts and all of these people that we've had on the show and talk and discuss some of our takeaways about what we've heard and what we've learned. And obviously, for listeners who are just tuning in for the first time, going through all of the episodes that we have is highly recommended, obviously, because there's a lot of great content that we're obviously not going to be able to cover in a quick sort of recap that we're doing, but it gives a general idea of what this podcast is about and what you can hope to learn.
Yeah. Yeah, well, and also I think it's great. Listeners have kind of heard from me a lot and kind of got a lot of my spin on things. And so it's nice to have Austin here, and Austin can give us his perspective on things. So I'm going to try to get him to be leading a lot of these conversations, or at least I'm going to ask him a lot of questions about things. So, we thought that, for me, the Ditto episode was clearly kind of a foundational thing for the whole core of the show, but it's not the only thing, but I think it captures a lot. And then, as you note, we had those episodes cover the political sectarianism paper, which came out in 2020, and it was an article in Science Magazine around the same time. So that was kind of right in the heat of the 2020 presidential elections when that came out. And I think it's very we'll talk about that a little bit. And then also I think we have the Jeffrey Berry episode, which was great to get him on. He wrote a book called Outrage Industry, which is a term that we use on the show a lot. And really that book and also that interview with him captures a lot of kind of what we're dealing with in terms of the sort of incentive structure part of it. And so I think that I think those episodes are always a great place to start for anybody that wants to know a little bit more about what this whole topic area is. And so I'd like to get, I'd love to get some of your thoughts on some of those things too, Austin.
Yeah, episodes like Ditto and Barry and the things they touch upon really form sort of the key to understanding what exactly outrage porn is, what exactly the outrage industry is all about. I think especially for me, what was really striking about Ditto was how he framed outrage in terms of our politics today, because so much, I think, of what people still talk about in terms of how outrage contributes to political divides is sort of this idea that it's all somehow based in policy, right? But the whole idea of political sectarianism is that it's based in morals and like moral superiority. And that's why this partisan divide is so intense. And so instead of just being able to, let's say, at the very least, agree to disagree, suddenly you can't even do that because you think that my side believes in XYZ, therefore, like I'm on some sort of moral high ground, right? And that's when it's really hard to come down from that. I think Jeffrey Berry also starts to bring up why this has become an even larger problem in the past few years is just because with things like social media sort of controlling almost like the narrative in terms of like what is news and like what is breaking news now, everything just kind of snowballs larger because suddenly it's not just, the traditional news that's spewing and spinning things out of control. Now it's everyone, right? Everyone can say something. Everyone can become a YouTuber, right? Go on social media, go on TikTok, spread whatever their opinion is and reach like a significant amount of people. And so suddenly this problem that was originally confined just to partisan newsrooms at the very least is suddenly just everywhere now. Um, and it's scary.
Yeah, and I think the two episodes, or the two series, the two guests that we had, really sort of feed each other in a lot of ways, in the sense that you get sort of Peter Ditto telling us a lot about some of the science and kind of what's going on, and that animosity and so on, and also mentioning the incentive structure. But then Jeffrey Berry really kind of gets into that, all the players that help that that leverage this and use it to their advantage, and how these it's a vicious cycle, where we kind of they agitate us, we get agitated, we want to do it, they want to do it more, that makes them want to do it more, and it just keeps heating up this whole environment and this whole landscape more and more and more, because there's so many players that have incentives to take advantage of this, right? I mean, you have social media, that's how they get their clicks and likes and reactions. You have the news media on cable TV and so on. That's how they get their viewers, and how they keep you agitated all the time. That's how they keep you coming back. Nobody really wants to watch, some people giving you just the facts, right? I mean, it has to be kind of exciting. And there's that moral aspect to it. We turn it on so we can validate that we were right. We made the right choice to choose our team, because the other team's so bad, because they tell us how the other team is bad all the time. And then that, same thing with the online media as well, where it's the same thing. They need clicks, they need views. So it's headlines, it's the content. It's always, this kind of adversarial type stuff, and it keeps us going. But then we want it because we like it, because it makes us feel good about our choices. And I've had so much pushback about that, right? I mean, well, there's two things. One are those blind spots that we all have to it, that I'm not doing that. I'm making a rational decision, right? I'm the rational one. The other people are the ones that are making weird logical decisions. So it's really funny that we all have those blind spots that we don't see in ourselves. And I think that's always sort of an ask that I have of the listeners. Like, if you're going to look at this partisan media, kind of go in with a lens more like sort of an anthropologist or a social scientist, and sort of look at what they're doing to you. And, you still may enjoy a little bit, but maybe if you can apply that lens to it, maybe you can realize that that's happening, right? And they're not always telling you the whole story either. I mean, whichever side you're listening to, they're not always telling you the whole story, and they're telling you kind of what you want to hear, and they're getting you mad. And you want to hear it, and you don't want to hear it, because you want to get mad at the other side there, and they're helping you do that, right? So, and I think it's so hard. That's one of the biggest. And I get so much pushback on this. Like, if we talk about that these are like sort of primal kind of things, primal tendencies. Probably this leaks into things like the Alex Korb neuroscience episode and some of the others, but that we have this kind of tribal nature that we start to tribe up, and we heard this with Stephen Rathje, that's just sort of an innate thing, and I get pushback on that too. I go, no, we don't, because the Native Americans, they helped other people. It's like, okay, well, you're not getting the same meaning of tribe. Like, a Native American tribe has now become social norms. It's a whole structure, it's a whole, that's a more higher level brain function. That was their culture. That was their morals, and their norms were to help other people, perhaps at certain tribes or whatever, right? But the tribal thing I'm talking about is so much more base, that when you don't know you're doing this when you're doing it, right?
Exactly.
It's way before your front brain has sort of figured out what's going on. And this is also what we forget, that it's not because we're dumb. It's like, in fact, sometimes we're better at fooling ourselves the smarter we are, because, we have that narration part of our brain that sort of justifies all the stuff that the base brain does. So the base brain already decided. So then our narration brain comes up with a logical reasoning for why we're doing it. Right now, it makes total sense to us.
Right. Yeah. To justify, right. Again, like why it is we feel this way. Yeah. Alex Korb, Stephen Rathje, so many of our guests have touched upon this idea, right? That deep down, subconsciously, psychologically, humans are just, tribal, right? In that way. And I think, talking about, you mentioned Stephen Rathje, I think one of the things from his episode that I think he answered that stuck out to me was, I think, going into this, working on outreach overload with you, one of the things that I was curious about really was how is it that, we're focusing on the negatives so easily. Obviously, there are the parts about it that's, down to maybe, outrage brings, entertainment value, right? Like going back to what you said, like just reporting on the facts is boring. No one wants to, hear that. But one of the things I think he touched upon was just how inherently negative the English language is. And it was for me, one of those like early on like light bulb moments of like, yeah, I would never have thought of it that way, but what he's saying is true, right? Like it's not just that focusing on the outrage, focusing on the negatives is entertaining, but it's also just so much easier for these people to do, right? Like, when it comes to, in simple like English terms, expressing like when we feel happy, right? Like, or you can say you're happy, you can maybe say you're excited. Um, and beyond that, there might be like one or two other like terms that might like pop into everyone's mind for, when they feel happy. But when you think about like the general idea of like feeling sad, right? There are so many, subcategories to that as to like why you're feeling sad, right? You can maybe be feeling depressed, disillusioned, disappointed. Maybe you're a bit, angry, etc. The list goes on and on. And I think that's, one of the main drivers as to why the outrage industry has been able to reach the scale that it has, is because it's so much easier to spin or talk about things in a way that uses these negatives that are just already present in the English language. And so I think realizing that all of this is already somewhat inherent and compounded by the fact that humans are tribal suddenly, made everything make a whole lot more sense, as to like why we are where we are today, for starters.
Yeah, and I think Stephen Rathje and also Alex Garb and I think some others as well have talked about some of the research. There's quite a bit of research on this that for some reason we also have this negativity bias, right? Where the
Right,
negative stuff is more likely to sort of sink in and play on us
right,
and that kind of thing. And it's like if you think of your job, review, if they said 10 positive things, one negative thing, what's the one you're going to be thinking about the next 3 days, right? It's going to be the one
right.
negative thing, right? And so we just have this negativity bias, and I think this plays into the outrage machine as well because they sort of know that too. And if they didn't know it through science, they sort of just learned it through experiment A/B tests and things like that. So they kind of know those get more reactions and they stick with people and they get more comments and they get people more riled up. So, they're going to, it's hard to find aspirational stories and aspirational things out there, right? I mean, everybody kind of
Yeah.
tells you these doomsayer things. And in fact, an episode coming up, actually probably will air by the time this app comes out. But anyway, I spent a bunch of time talking on the Simkin intro. I don't know if you've had a chance to check that, but I don't remember now. Anyway, I spent a bunch of time sort of saying like things aren't as bad as we think they are sometimes, right? I mean, we can
Right.
fall into this thing that everything's terrible, and we sometimes have to put that in perspective. That if somebody's telling you things are really terrible, they're probably not telling you again. So they're probably not telling you the whole story.
Yeah, it's definitely the case, even in news and like news media, which is, a big contributor to this problem and has been, trashed by all sides essentially.
Yeah, and what I think one of the biggest takeaways that I've kind of learned in this is that it it's it stays this way and it keeps getting worse because all those things feed on each other. It's not really
Right.
one thing. It's that it becomes moralized, and then that kind of makes us seek it out more, and it's sort of a combination of that all these incentives that are there to make that happen combined, and us being one of the incentives too. Like I say, we like it, we want it, and then also combined with this blind spot piece, right, where we don't even know we don't realize we're doing it. I mean, I think I see this all the time in like online forums. and the reaction to things. So like, I'll post something about a study that said that partisans are more likely to consider the people on their side, those in the same party, or as more kind and more generous and more moral and so on, and they're more likely to think people in the other party are mean and hostile and violent, things like this. And the responses come back, that's because Joe Biden and the radical left, or that's because Trump. And it's like you're doing the thing that this is talking about right now, and we
Right,
just
right.
can't see when we're doing it. And so that, I think that really adds to it, that we have this incentive structure combined with a lot of the psychology going on, and then just and it's very hard for us to break out. And I get encouraged, with some of the people that I talk to, and we'll have more episodes along these lines. As I've recorded some more episodes with folks kind of in this bridge building space, for I think that's kind of the general term we're using for it, talking about how that it's kind of it's going to take a movement, and we're starting to see maybe people are finally, this idea of the exhausted majority and things like that, that maybe we're starting to see that there's enough people kind of getting fed up with it, and then maybe that will help you sort of say, well, what is going on, and can I be more aware of it, and this kind of thing. And so, maybe there's at some point all the pieces align and the walls come tumbling down. But that's the best hope that I have, because it's not going to happen from regulation. It's not going to happen from Congress.
Right.
I mean, there's going to be top down pieces of it, but some of that's going to have to be pressure from the bottom up as well. And I think it's going to require a movement to really get us out of this. And I think it requires that realization, because the other recent pushbacks we've had is sort of like, you shouldn't be talking about polarization, and you shouldn't be talking about, this lowering the temperature, because the real problem is XYZ, like pick radicalization on the right, it's anti-democracy, something like that. And it's like, okay, well, that's a problem, but you can't solve any of these problems when things are set to boil, like David Troy said, right? Like, it doesn't work, because now you can't have that debate.
Right.
And that's what we have to. So no one's on this show or any of these. I don't think any of these bridge building things are saying you can't have you can't be an advocate, you can't have strong feelings about certain issues or whatever. No one's telling you to suddenly everybody diverge to the center. I mean, I think there are some people out there that's what they want, is everybody to sort of merge to a moderate or centrist position. But we're not really saying that. You can still hold your views. What we're saying is we have to lower this temperature so we can have those dialogues in a productive way, because right now it's just not, right. And again, I'm actually, even that sentence right there actually speaks a little bit to the problem, because I said it never happens, blah, blah, blah. And part of that, but it does sometimes happen, right? I mean, sometimes you do have a good debate. Sometimes you do get compromise. And those are the things you don't see the news media talking about very often, right? And in fact, you'll even see people, partisans, talking about that, like, well, they caved, they're traitors, blah, 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 because they compromised on something. And that has to change too, to where we're going to have to be more tolerant and more supportive, in fact, of, not necessarily compromising, giving up your values, but finding ways to move forward. And sometimes compromise is the best we have, and we're going to have to do that and live with maybe not everything we want. And also, even just having the dialogue, at least encourage your legislators to have that dialogue, at least. Like, they're not just up there screaming bloody murder about the other side, which is theater we kind of like, again, but it doesn't get anybody anywhere. I mean, nobody has ever won an argument by calling the other person stupid or whatever, right?
I think what our podcast does is really good and really necessary. Is, yeah, we're pushing back against the idea of like the belief, or like, the logic then of like lowering the temperature is, let's say, like automatically let's just like have everyone in the center. I don't think like that's what we're saying, right? Because at the end of the day, there are like so many pitfalls to that as well, right? And there are situations where, quite frankly speaking, only one side is to blame, right? Having the episode that we had with Berryman, right? I think like really helped hammer that home, this idea of like, no, there are certain things that are quite simply just facts, right? And so like going into sort of a compromise of, oh, let's try and understand what the other side is talking about, right? That's not necessarily the way to go about it. You're just then giving all of these radicals on one side the opportunity to continue spouting their misinformation. Instead, it's about, okay, how do we focus on having conversations in a way that can bring people in rather than, calling them out, right? And I think that was actually a point that you brought up in one of one of the episodes. I think it was with Kevin Bates on the episode about COVID. This idea of like, yeah, when we talk to people who might hold views, right? Let's say someone who's like a vaccine skeptic, right? How do we go with that conversation in a way that they don't feel like we're calling them out, but rather, we're calling them in, right? We're trying to understand, um, or maybe I don't know if understand is the right word, but rather we're trying to make sure that we get our message across to them in a way that doesn't make them feel like they're any worse for originally having the concerns that they're having, right? Like if someone is saying that, oh, I'm, skeptic about the COVID vaccine because like I heard it alters your genes. Okay, scientifically, it doesn't alter your genes, right? But rather than, kind of scoffing and being like, well, that's just false. It obviously doesn't do that, right? How do you approach telling them it doesn't alter your genes in a way where they don't feel like they're, being targeted and being called stupid for having this worry that it does, right? And I think that's the beauty of the work that we're doing on this podcast, essentially, is that, all of these experts are talking to us and giving us ways to approach the solution in a way that calls these people in rather than like pushing them and calling them out.
Yeah, and it's funny that bringing up the Kevin Bass episode and sort of even just thinking about the whole COVID time, the lockdowns and all that 2020 era especially, but even that couple of years there, and how political that all got, how politicized everything became. And in some extent, that was also a driver for me starting this podcast because, we talk about like, yeah, we want to solve this problem at this kind of global or national scale or something. Wouldn't that be wonderful? There's also a level of it that's just like there's in the microcosm, right? There's so many families and friends and others that have kind of been torn apart, off. Sometimes it was related to COVID, but it was sometimes just politics. It was kind of the Trump era, and everybody got really excited about that, and that became very polarizing. And then I think COVID kind of added on, and a lot of families have disconnected or have bruises and scars from that. So there's also, I think, a piece of this podcast that starts with, just those little beats. Start at that micro level. Like, is there somebody you love in your family that, maybe it's time to reconnect or unblock them on Facebook or, start
Right.
somewhere. Can we go
Right.
for a walk? Can we have a talk? And I think that's a big piece of it too. And, and I'm as guilty as that as anybody else. So, I'm not always the perfect model either, but I'm learning and I'm getting,
Right.
and I'm finding out better ways and trying to do the same thing like everybody else. So there's also that sort of this micro level, more
Right.
personal level where, just, revisiting some of this, they're like, okay, I got blocked, they blocked me, this and that. What really happened? Is that relationship? Can I restore it? Should I restore it? Is it something I want in my life? And I think looking at a lot of that, I think COVID was a particularly strong catalyst in that during
Right.
that period. And people just got really, we were stressed, we were worried about getting sick. So I think that elevated the tension a lot, and people became a lot more rigorous and dug their heels in on all sides. And and I think that's a good model for kind of like, okay, well, that's what we did and we get it, but now maybe it's time to revisit some of that.
Yeah, and going off of what you were saying about starting at that micro level, right? It's not even just about, reaching out to, those loved ones, but even just starting really with your own self, right? Like I think, we're both also learning as we go along and as we listen to what these experts have to say. And I think it was Alex Korb who said, gave this analogy of right? Like putting on your oxygen mask before you help others with theirs. And I think that's like a key part in all of this, right? And one of the reasons why we've fallen into this spiral and sort of this idea of like our views make us morally superior to the others is because we're not focusing enough on understanding perhaps why it is that we have the views that we have and, sort of being able to back our own views up. We just kind of have our views and then say, right, we have our views. Our views are the right views, and then sort of go from there. But as sort of like, I think it was Alex Hinton who said, like, yeah, like in terms of developing your own, moral compass first, right? Like making sure your moral compass is as fully developed as possible involves like doing a lot of work on yourself first and your reviews first, understanding why it is that you have um, the views that you have, and finding perhaps like the evidence out there in the news that can back that up. And I think Eppert also talks about this, right? Like learning on ourselves how to be um, literate when it comes to news. What that even means, starting with ourselves, that's what will allow us to not only get as close as possible to like what is the factual truth in a situation, but then really help allow us to finally move forward and like talk with other people. And it will probably help once we know where we get our views from and we can like pinpoint exactly how they came about, so that when we go and talk to people who disagree with us, our immediate go to when they disagree with us isn't just, oh, well, you're wrong, you're stupid. Um,
Well, especially if we've been in our bubble and we hear this kind of alternative view for the first time. Like, I think that's another piece about, as a little practical matter, when you're going to have a dialogue with somebody, like somebody that you think might be on a different, with some different views, try to listen first. I mean, just focus on,
yeah,
try to put yourself in listen mode entirely at first.
right,
Don't even think about pushing back, maybe just exploratory
right,
questions, that kind of thing. But
right,
don't try to change their mind. Don't try to argue with them. Let it sink
right,
in for like a day. Like let all
right,
all their positions sink in
right,
for a day before reacting, and that and also get to know them besides politics, right? Because
right,
you may find this visceral reaction really you can't stand them if the only dialogue you've ever had is politics. So
right,
go bowling or go for a walk, do something besides talk
right,
about politics, and then start
right,
talking politics and start off by completely listening. Now those are
right,
simple, concrete things. It's actually not that hard to just do the listen. It's a little harder when it's somebody close to you. So a little bit more removed, like if they're a neighbor, you kind of casually know. It's probably easier to do that listening than if they're really, really close to you and you find these views they have is kind of crazy.
right,
It can be a little harder to do that listen, but it's really not that hard. Almost any of us can do it. If you go in with that as your plan, I'm not going to argue. I'm going to listen and maybe ask exploratory questions like, how did you come to know this kind of thing. You might find yourself getting angrier and angrier as you learn what they say. But I think if you keep reminding yourself, I'm just here to listen and learn and take it in, and I'll come back to it later, and then you kind of decide what's my next phase. Do I want to begin to ask some of those things? And this kind of gets back to something I was going to talk about a little bit too, is that, because of national cable TV and everybody else, we get caught up in national politics, and it just becomes like a blood sport. It's like, and we get like, how many of these national issues do we actually care about? Like, do we need, like, should we be, are there other people that could worry about some of these national issues? And maybe we should
mhm,
be looking more local things like in our community and things like that. So, I mean, I think there's some room for filtering there too. It's like,
right,
you can't be outraged about everything.
right,
But we are, right, because if the other side said it, then we're mad about it. And so, and we also just get caught up in, like, how often do you even see a local news story, right? I mean, you turn on TV, there aren't very many. If you have local channels, they might have some stuff, but even the local channels are often occupied a good percentage of that time with these big national issues. And kind of
right,
keep asking yourself, like, how much does this affect my life, my life, my
right,
family,
right,
people that are close to me, people that I love? and say,
Right.
well, how much energy do I want to, how much do I want to worry about this? And it kind of reminds me of, there's I think it's from the Stoics, and I don't know who said it, but and I'm going to paraphrase, I'm not going to get it right, but it's kind of along these lines. Okay, can you do anything about it? No, then quit complaining. Can you do something about it? Then yes, then quit complaining and do
Right,
something.
right, right. I think that point goes to, maybe an issue that I don't think has been talked about as much by our guests on the show, but I love the fact that you bring this up. This idea of, yes, like, why is it that, we should start local and, start with the people around us, right? And, what is it that really we can do? Because I think there's this idea, I think, of how some people might, know that there's a problem, but then at the same time be sort of overly ambitious in believing that like suddenly they can also, if there's something they can do on the macro level, right, to solve this problem. And at the end of the day, like for most people, that's just like not the case, right? Like you and like you and I are starting this podcast in the hope that, we can slowly, even like at this sort of like micro level, right? The more listeners we reach, the more people sort of understand this problem and how it is that we get ourselves out of this spiral. But even then, we started this podcast with like sort of more of a micro level lens that hopefully as this grows, we'll hopefully be able to get to that macro level rather than just start off and being like, I'm going to be the one that's going to, make this grand change and stop all of this. And that's where when people, start off with sort of that ambitious lens, that's when all the burnout then also starts happening, right? When they
Right.
realize that like this problem is so complicated and so large. And it is. So, one person alone is not going to change it. But when a lot of people start changing it at a micro level of reaching out to people that they know of, you get all of these sort of micro pods essentially of people who are doing this. And then, that's where the macro level change will gradually happen if people work on the micro stuff. So I think, yeah, definitely it's about, focusing on that rather than just looking for some like overarching way of like, let's petition Congress to do something, about this, like let's petition Congress to look into, how we regulate media, yada, 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 because like that's just not going to happen for so many reasons. Um, both, one of the reasons being, I think that like we've finally sort of come to the realization that our modern day actual politicians aren't the ones we saw in the West Wing, right?
Yeah.
And so, rather than going towards that route and then getting quickly exhausted by things not happening, yeah, starting small, seeing the small changes from there. Um,
And that
and
does tie into that whole sort of put your oxygen mask on first thing, because,
right,
if we're
yeah,
not doing that,
and
we can't do anything.
exactly. And, it just all starts really at the most micro level with yourself. And I think the other thing I wanted to touch upon too, that you mentioned is, yeah, starting off, when you reach out to people who, might have differing opinions from you, not only just listening and asking exploratory questions, but being almost, having an idea about what you hope to accomplish with those exploratory questions in the sense of like, yeah, making sure that the exploratory questions you're asking gives you an idea of why it is they're coming from, the perspective they're coming from. Um, and when you're listening, and I think this was one of the things that Tiffany Terry Thomas touched upon that I found really enlightening was we all in America, at least for a large part, right? Like we all speak English, but we don't really speak necessarily the same English. And what I think she means by that, and sort of what I mean when I, you know, parrot it out like that is don't just listen to someone literally, but also listen to them connotatively, right? Like they can say something, but what is it maybe that like deep down they actually mean with those words? And I think that will help you also in terms of whether or not or how deeply you should engage with this person, right? I think like if you're talking to, let's say, like a Rust Belt, X factory worker, right? And they're talking about, oh, all of our, jobs going to immigrants, going abroad and etc. Maybe like think about it and ask them, right? Like, what is it that you mean, when you actually say that? On one hand, it could totally be that, they're just xenophobic, right? And they're just saying all of this stuff. But on the other hand, it could just be that, like, yes, this is like the line that they're being fed from like their news media outlets, but it's really just their expression of, I'm frustrated because I don't have a job. And I think my government doesn't care about people like me anymore, right? And it could just be that connotatively, that's what they mean when they spew all of this stuff out. So rather than just taking what they're saying at, sort of its face value, what those words actually mean individually, is there a message underneath that perhaps they're trying to convey and they just can't convey as well? Um, and going from there, to try and see, try and talk to them on that level once you understand what it is they're really concerned about deep down.
Right. And this is particularly true in a lot of this media and politician driven language that, a lot of, we sort of get, you sort of have, this kind of left leaning media saying one thing and right leaning media saying another thing. And there's so much code and sort of, the dog whistle kind of stuff. And it can mean so much. And like you say, you might be talking about two different, almost two different things, even though you're using the same words. So yeah, and I found that out a lot in the street outrage interviews too, where, I could try to kind of, what do you mean by that, or how, and that's also a good way, by the way, if you are trying to have the person kind of understand where they're coming from more, that they might start questioning themselves a little bit on it too. Like, yeah, what do I mean by that? Like, what do I, I mean, again, we're not necessarily going to manipulate people, but you can at least get, you can kind of have people thinking about this too. But and also, like you say, just to get us on the same page, like, what are we even talking about? I mean, I've noticed it, just throughout the language of the street outrage interviews, but one place where it's really been visible is when I started kind of introducing some questions about wokeness and cancel culture and stuff like that. And, that's a word, those are some words that, are, and you'd think like, I should stop being surprised by the stuff I learned from these street outrage interviews, but I was kind of surprised to find that it's so much more nuanced. There's so many more variations on what people kind of are thinking about when they're using that languages, because you sort of get, there's kind of this one side media, whether it's on Twitter or somebody else, that is kind of the calling out part of kind of wokeism and all that, and then there's kind of the other right leaning stuff that I'm talking about, this one thing. And it's kind of funny that in real life, I don't think I've found anyone that actually uses those definitions the way the media kind of uses them, right, and the way politicians use them.
Exactly.
It's super interesting because, again, I should not be surprised because I'm getting surprised so often. I should just stop. I should be surprised when I'm not surprised, kind of thing. But I mean, it was very interesting. And the other funny thing about that, kind of to your point about how we use words, is that with one person in particular, I was kind of kept asking, well, what do you mean by woke? And instead of explaining what they meant by woke, they would just continue to use the term a bunch of times. Yeah, well, I don't like when the woke do this and when the woke do that. It's like, well, can we step back for a second? Just, it was very hard because he just sort of assumed we all meant the same thing. And that comes back to that whole thing that we all kind of think we're the baseline for everything, right? So we sort of think everybody understands the language the same way we do. And I'm sort of another one of my little hobbies is kind of language. I'm sort of a language nerd when it comes to that, particularly language history and how they evolve. And it's so crazy. Like, we sort of think people have always talked like us if they speak English, right? But it's like not even close, right? I mean, we'd have a hard time understanding people from a few centuries ago, not only from just the actual pronunciation of things, but also just the phrases and the turn of phrase and the way they put things together.
Yeah.
a bunch of it, we wouldn't understand what was going on at all. Like I always loved the time machine people, like go back to Victorian or way before that. Like they go back to medieval times. They just sort of talk to people like, oh no, you would have no idea what anyone's saying.
You would, yeah, no, yeah, absolutely.
Well, I
Yeah,
wanted to make sure we sort of talk about this a little bit more sort of meta podcasty stuff. But, I'm always looking for more feedback and, we don't get as much as I'd like. So I'd love for folks to get more involved, like send us emails. We really read them all. We take them seriously. We're trying to deliver a show that gives listeners, what they're looking for. So we really do want that feedback. I mean, I kind of know I get this episode maybe the worst, because, I think one bit of feedback I get is people would sort of rather listen to the guest than listen to me, right? So here I am talking on an episode, but without one of our experts. But so that's sort of one bit of feedback I've got. So, okay, so I've tried to work with that. I think some shows need more sort of setup in the intro than others. But I've tried to take that to heart and get make sure the episode, is mostly about the experts. And we've sort of not done Street Outrage since the beginning because basically we're just trying to keep the episodes shorter and there's been so much good content from the guests. But we do have a lot of Street Outrage content and I do want to do more with it. And I just, I don't know exactly how, but I hope that we'll be able to work more Street Outrage back in. And we're committed to keep the show ad free. So if you are able to make a donation to help make that possible, we're not looking to try to make a lot of money here. We're just trying to help cover some of the costs. So if that's something, and also if you are a patron and you have donated, that's great. I really appreciate it. Thanks so much. But also, if you have something you'd sort of like for it, like, okay, do you want, behind the scenes content or something, like maybe you can give us some ideas of what kind of stuff would be interesting. Maybe more shows like this, that would be, I don't know, only available to patrons or something. I don't know, but we're open to ideas on that front as well. But do give that feedback. Like if you complain about the show, don't do it to your friends. Do it to us. Tell us what's wrong with the show. We really want it. We want to hear that feedback. Whether it's about the format, the content, whatever. We want to hear all that stuff. Probably won't hurt our feelings, but even if it does, we still want the feedback.
exactly. That's how we're going to improve this show, right? So, like you just said, David, yeah, like if our listeners have any, critiques on the show, please tell us. We do appreciate any and all feedback.
Yeah, we absolutely do because, we're a small show. We're still trying to grow. We're still trying to build our audience, and we really want this to be a show that is giving the audience something they want. So, so what else would you like to finish with? Well, I will talk about a little bit one of my hot buttons. We talked a little bit about the sort of being literate, information literate, and it's interesting that, the information sources that people have that I learn about in the Street Outrage segments, and I think it's a little bit self-selective because they've decided to come on. So I think most of the people that have done Street Outrage episodes probably are more tuned with news sources than most people. I think some of the research we've seen shows that so many people just don't sort of tune to anything. But there's such a huge trust factor out there that people are, choosing these really questionable sources and they just don't trust anything anymore. And that's probably one of my biggest concerns and one of my pet peeves. You can kind of get me going if you say like your information sources, sort of these three people, and I'm like, oh my God, please no, don't do that, right? And I have to try more of my own, preach my own gospel there, and call them in more than call them out. But
right.
But yeah, it's really hard. Like sure, if you're watching any show, any show, particularly TV. But also, particularly if you're going down a little bit more partisan type stuff, are they telling you the whole story? No, they never. They probably seldom are telling you the whole story. So where should you turn? Should you turn to a 4chan channel or Reddit or something? Probably not.
Exactly.
You should probably turn to a better source. And identifying what a better source is can be a little bit challenging, but. It really, you can, there are sources out there, are tools out there to sort of see what's more credible. But, as simple terms like New York Times sort of leans left, Wall Street Journal leans left, you can get that left-leaning view. Something like the Washington Post leans left, sorry. The Wall Street Journal sort of centrist leans right, so you can get kind of a right-leaning view. And those are all pretty credible sources. Sure, they have opinion material stuff that's not always that great, but, in general, they have a real news team and they do real news. And then something more centrist stuff is like AP or Reuters and are more neutral, I guess I'll say, less less likely to put a partisan spin on things. But of course, they're also the most boring, right? Because when you read that
Right,
neutral story, it's the most boring version you could get, right? But at
right,
least you can get that. But I think the big thing there is that there is nuance and stuff, but you're not really going to get that nuance by going on message boards, by looking
right,
at Twitter, by looking at and some of the stuff on Twitter. Sure, somebody says a thing, but really back that up with something better than Twitter, right? I mean, if there
right,
may be a
exactly.
really steady journalist, then maybe that tweet is pretty solid. But kind of this is my most frustrating. There's so many people out there with bad intentions. Like when people say, I'll just use one name. If people say, well, you need to hear the other side, so go listen to Alex Jones. It's like, no, I don't need to
No,
listen to Alex
yeah,
Jones. That's
right,
not giving me a different side. That he's not
right,
bringing things in good faith. He's not a good faith
right,
actor. So
right,
you're only getting dumber to listen to somebody like
right,
Alex Jones, right? And
right,
and there's probably people on the left that are the same way. I think the Palmer Report or something like that is kind of one of these kind of crazy left wing. It's not really left wing in the same way of like they're not really preaching violence or anything, but it's just very optimistic nonsense, right? So you're not
right,
getting a full story. You're not getting more informed from somebody like the Palmer Report on the left any more than you are from Alex
right,
Jones on
right,
the right. So that's what bothers me. If you're going to look for alternative, if you want to see it like a balanced position, you don't turn to somebody like that. They're not helping. They're not helping.
right, right,
They have an
right,
agenda, and there's no
right,
good faith in it.
exactly. Exactly. Yeah, and going off of that, I'm going to bring up a quote that I think, David, you're probably tired of hearing this quote because I think in our past, conversations I've brought this quote up so much. But on the record, I guess, to our listeners, it'll be perhaps the first time I'm saying this quote, but it was Christian Amanpour who said, like, be objective, not neutral, right? And I think that's the thing, right? Yeah, like neutrality, you think, listening to people like Alex Jones, the Palmer Report, whatnot, will sort of like neutralize, even things out. Like, no, like that's not what that's actually doing, right? Like objectivity and neutrality are two separate things, and you should focus on like what is actually objective. And so listening to episodes or hearing experts like Epper talk about how it is to be news literate, um, I think that's really helpful. And it also helps understand, yes, it may be that a lot of people in journalism may be left leaning, but that doesn't mean they just like write out their left leaning agenda stuff and then that just gets automatically published. There's a huge vetting, editing process that goes to an article before they publish it because they have to, because all of these legitimate news sources, the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, they're also incentivized to catch other people's mistakes and errors out. So if you read all of these, legitimate news sources and amalgamate your information that way, at some point you will come to what is a clearer picture of what the truth actually is, um,
And
rather
that was
than
a lot.
just
That was a lot what our whole sort of Holocaust denial episode was about. That
right,
the whole both sides thing can happen too, where if you give both sides without qualifying it, you're not. That's not a fair assessment of. It's not a good picture of what reality is, right? If there's sort
right,
of 97% of a community of researchers of science of solid data that sort of leans one way, and there's 3% the other way, and you give them equal weight on your show, and don't qualify that, and don't have them explain, hey, you're in the 3%, and sure, once in a while the 3% was right and the 97% was wrong. So tell us like why the 97% is wrong, but just make clear to your audience that this person is coming from the 3%er place,
right, right,
and make sure you qualify that, because if you just present them equally, that's not a fair representation of reality.
right. Yeah, exactly. And yeah, and I think, from even like I know so much of like the stuff we talk about, and what listeners should be focusing on is sort of on the micro level of stuff. But with this sort of specific example of like news and etc., just like bring up a quick like macro example that you and I talk about a lot. But it's just like it's not as if a large news media organization has not tried the sort of neutrality route, right? That's the entire crux of what the, Chris Licht at CNN era was about, right? And that sort of went up in flames because at the end of the day, that's not just how you go about, doing things.
Right. You can't have unqualified. You can't just let the crazy person and the sort of main, I don't know, mainstream isn't right, but the one that sort of fits with the most the consensus and the crazy person have sort of equal share. Like you do have to qualify that.
Right.
Like, yeah, the crazy person might be right,
Right.
but let's make sure everyone knows they're coming from this other place. So let's have that. They're the ones who kind of have to bring the evidence and show why everybody else is wrong. And this is what my part of what my pet peeve is too, is that there's so much. It's easy to get, like, if you want to get, a lot of likes and follows and people excited about your podcast or your Instagram page, you don't do what I'm doing, where you say like simple little sane factoids, right? you you say the crazy thing. Like that's what's going to get you the likes and the shares and the
Right.
retweets and going to get your channel. Everyone's going to get excited about it. But so it's so easy to do that. That's why you see so much of it. Like it's pretty easy to sort of have a conspiracy theory channel, and it all sounds. We're going to cover more of this kind of conspiracy theory stuff probably in some future episodes. But it's like, that's the easy route, right? In some sense, it's like you're
Right.
cheating, right? This is not fair to the
Right.
rest of us. But it's because it's just it's titillating. We like it. We want to hear these conspiracy theories. So this is the RFK Jr. kind of thing, right? I mean, this guy I think is another one of these. I don't think he's a good faith actor. I think he's out there trying to get sort of visibility and publicity and so on by being pretty far out there. And maybe he does say something that's right once in a while, but I mean, it's not helpful. Those kind of people generally don't inform. You're getting dumber to listen to those kind of people. You're not getting smarter. You're not hearing the other side.
Right.
Yeah, and I'll say that that's something that has been encouraging, even though we don't, like I say, don't get a lot of feedback, but I have had folks, really, you can really see that they were changed at least in part by the show, right? They took on some of these ideas and they look at things with a different lens, and they're less stressed out because of it, right?
Right.
And they can sort of focus. They still can be passionate about their issues, but I think they can focus more and kind of be super outraged, like over here instead of everywhere all the
Right.
time.
Yeah.
And I guess on that front, I want to finish with a few more of the I mean, we sometimes, don't like the cliche stuff, but some of it does sort of help. And I think a couple of ones that I'll recommend may or may not work for you, but you can try it. But I really think try to get a sleep routine. That's huge. I mean, getting a good night's sleep and getting that wind down period. So like try to exclude doom scrolling or, even checking into news media and especially political stuff kind of at bedtime. Like turn that stuff off, wind down from it. That's, I think it was Kurt Gray who talked about how, sort of our bed and our bedroom are supposed to be the safest places in the house. It's the last place you want to bring all this fear and outrage, right?
Right.
So
Yeah.
like exclude that stuff at bedtime. Maybe pick it
Right.
up in the morning or next day. It can almost always wait. And I think that's another piece of the whole "it can always wait" thing. Like there's always that old saying about, I'm in this, and I'm going to put this in the context of like, I'm in this Twitter fight. I've got to finish this Twitter fight tonight. No, you don't. You don't have to finish the Twitter fight
Yeah.
tonight. The Twitter fight can go, if you in the morning, you still feel like having the Twitter fight, it can wait till morning. Trust me.
Yeah.
And I think other, just dumb little stuff like that. I mean, eating better, getting exercise, maybe meditate or yoga, something like that. And I think another biggie is get outdoors. I think all those things can help us. So, I mean, that's the other side of the micro level is some of this is just reducing a lot of the stress from this and,
Exactly.
picking your times of when you engage, kind of engaging with a lens of, more of an observer, maybe a little bit as much as you can. And then all those other little things can help too. So I will say that, and I've gotten, like I said, I've gotten some feedback that folks, have taken some of that to heart and it's helped.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. All of those things, yeah, will help you, you know, approach this topic from a position of calm and peace rather than just from a position of stress that can easily boil over into outrage.
Yeah. And we have a lot more episodes coming up. I mean, of course, in the very beginning of the show, a lot of people thought, even when I was researching before I even started the show, a lot of people sort of thought this was going to be the show that was going to teach you how to fix the other side.
Mm,
You know, and they're going to get them to think the right way, you know, but that's clearly not what it's about. And it's not, and that's a misguided mission anyway, right? But we are
right.
going to have some experts on the show that kind of talk about that idea. Like, hey, if you really want to talk to somebody and see if you can change their mind, you know, here's a step-by-step guide. Like, are you
Mm,
ready for this? Like, it's not
mm,
easy. Do you want to do
yeah.
this? And it's even, you know, that kind of thing. And it's like, you know, so again, it comes back to your question. Like, if you're going to have you know, setting your mindset, like if you're going to have a dialogue with somebody, you know, setting that mindset right from the beginning. Like, why am I having this conversation? Am I here to manipulate them to think differently, or do I really want to explore and learn things like that? Like, what outcome do I really want?
Right. Right.
But so we will have some of that. I mean, again, I think it's a misguided idea, but that's kind of what the episode's going to help explain. But there are techniques you can try to use if you really want to persuade someone that are solid. Like, these are, you know, things that they're not like the marketing style techniques that we found in research. Don't, you know, science has shown, yeah, they can persuade you in the moment to buy the thing, but then you regret it immediately. So that's not the kind of thing we're talking about, because that science does work, but it's not helpful for like a political kind of position, because it has no
Right.
lasting effect. Whereas these kind of things, maybe you can actually move people on move the needle somebody. You may not completely get them to
Right.
change. And the question is, do you really want to do that? Like, I'll tease that episode a little bit more and say that the question I like to think about when you're doing that is, if you know somebody and they're a passionate Christian, and let's just say there was a magic way to do this. I'm not saying there is, or anything like that, and obviously there kind of isn't. But if there was a magic way you could convince them there was no historical Jesus, would that be, or there was no God, one of the, you know, something like that. If you could, like, there was just some magic trick that you could do that. Is that an ethical thing to do? So I think that's sort of a question. If someone's going to go
Mm,
down this path, you know, be thinking about this in a serious way, because potentially you could move the needle, help somebody move their needle. And is it an ethical thing to do for the context you're trying to do it in? So
mm.
before you go down that path, think of it as something like that. Like, is that an ethical thing to do to somebody?
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, definitely.
So, I mean, I was going to kind of wrap up with that. What do you want to wrap up with? I mean, I love that the audience gets to hear more of your thoughts, and I like hearing them too, because, you know, I see everything my certain way, and I'm like there, and then actually Austin has a great point about this topic that I didn't think of before.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And actually, I will say, and I've told you this, a lot before as well, but I also actually do really enjoy hearing your thoughts about this as well, because I do think both of us are coming from this with a perspective of we're also on like the learning path, the journey here. And so it's great to hear from experts. But at the same time, I think and I would hope that some of the questions and thoughts that we have might also be what some of our listeners are also thinking of, because we're really in the same perspective as they are. It's not like we're also experts and we're approaching this as like an expert on expert conversation. No, it's like we're just like our listeners in the sense that, we want to learn. We are also exhausted and tired about, this whole outrage industry. And we also want to find ways that will slowly allow ourselves to not keep falling in this spiral and to pull ourselves out. So definitely the same thing goes for David, your thoughts too. I always enjoy hearing them. So I think even though I know you've gotten like the feedback on like the listeners wanting to hear more of the expert stuff, I think, you know, your perspectives in all of these episodes, I guess, at least in my opinion, are equally as important.
Oh, well, thank you. Yeah, like I say, if you do give feedback, you probably get a lot more weight in your feedback, because you'll be one of the few that has. So, so anybody, if you do have suggestions for the show, we'll always take it seriously.
Yeah, yeah.
All right. Well, yeah. So we do have a lot coming up. I'm really excited about some of the new things coming up. Like I said, we've also had. I mean, I think some of the guests. If you haven't heard all the episodes we've done, there's a few that. I mean, obviously they're all great to go back to. But I think that Berryman is a good one on the sort of both sides stuff. The Jeffrey Berry and the outrage industry. We also didn't mention Tobias Rose Stockwell and the outrage machine, which talks a lot about the history of some of this and some other ideas, some different ideas, and kind of some ideas about what's this dilemma look like going forward and things like that. So those are some key episodes. I think people really seem to like the Alexander Hinton, who's a anthropologist. So that might be an episode you might like to see or go listen to. And we really enjoyed Stephen Ratcha, and I hope to have him on the show again in the future.
Yeah. And, I think, there are so many great episodes that we already have, and so many more great episodes to come to listen to that, if you're just starting out and this is one of the first episodes you're listening to, and if you're someone who agrees with people who say, we want to hear more from the experts, go back and listen to all of those. We have so many of those episodes waiting there for you to listen to. So definitely, if hearing from experts is what you want, yes, feel free to, peruse through all of the episodes that we have and keep listening to all of the good episodes that we have to come.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, so it's all out there on, you can all find it all on the web easily at outrageoverload.net. You can find the show anywhere on any of the players, Apple, Google, Spotify, all that stuff. And if you go to the website, outrageoverload.net, you'll see in the footer, there's a contact page that has all the different ways to contact us, all the socials. The email is outrageoverload@gmail.com. We really do read all those emails. I read all my DMs. And we even have a phone number you can call and leave us a voice message at 925-552-7885. That's just, you can make a little short recording there. And if you have something that you might want to have appear on the show, maybe you'll be on the show at some point if you leave a message there. So yeah, there's a lot of ways to contact us. So please use those. So thanks for listening, everybody. And we will get back to doing those expert shows as soon as we can. All right, folks, thanks for joining us. And thanks, Austin. Thanks for coming on to help me out.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, David.
That is it for this episode of the Outrage Overload podcast. This episode was a departure for us. I don't expect to do this very often, but I'd really like to get your feedback. Contact me at Outrage Overload on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram, or email outrageoverload@gmail.com. Visit outrageoverload.net, where you can find past episodes. You can also find past episodes on Apple, Spotify, and all the major podcast apps and platforms. If you would like to help the show to help pay for transcription, hosting, and other costs to make the show better, there's a page for contributing on the website. If you really want to support the show, tell everyone you know about it. Share it on social media, let them know. Okay. Watch for an all-new regular episode next week.